Welcome to the latest episode of the Performance Gap podcast. Today, we'll be sitting down with Sam Dutney, a rowing coach and exercise scientist over 20 years working with high school athletes all the way up to the world championship level. In today's episode, we'll be discussing why copying elite level performers is one of the common reasons why rowers and everyday athletes stay stuck, the true insight into load management and how that looks alongside how you can make the most of your endurance training. Let's jump in. Sam, what's the performance gap in training individualization for recreational athletes?
Well, the performance gap for recreational athletes when it comes to individualization is that there's this common belief that something that worked well for a top performer in any sport or any type of physical activity is automatically the best option for everyone. And the reality is that if you are, LeBron James versus, Leroy Bryan, the weekend warrior, then you come from an extremely different training background, extremely different physiology, scheduled training program, etc. So the obvious thing is that the training should look different. But we have this idea that the methods used by someone who has excelled is therefore the best option, when the reality is sometimes it wasn't even the best option for them.
Definitely. And I think we're probably swayed a lot on social media by seeing what's fancy or what is the individual of influence doing that we can actually copy in our training. I guess for you, obviously your background, coaching over 1,500 athletes in your sport, which is rowing, where have you found the difference between those that are actually moving the needle in comparison to those that are staying plateaued in their own performance?
Well, there's really two areas as I see it anyway. The first is that people who get stuck often go looking for specific sessions. So they see something, whether it's social media, whether it's YouTube, or whether it's something that they did in the past that they felt was really effective. They go looking to kind of staple sessions together rather than actually putting it together in a cohesive way. So you end up with these scenarios where for people who've plateaued, they might end up doing, if they train 4 or 5, whatever the number of times per week, all of the training they do is built around these kind of memorable sessions. And the issue with that is that generally they're a lot harder, which is why they're memorable and why they kind of stand out on social media. But the problem is that you can't just staple hard sessions together endlessly and expect to be able to keep improving performance, because at some point you end up with too much residual fatigue, and then you can no longer perform as well in those sessions to actually elicit the training response that you need to get the benefit from them. For the people who I find don't fall into that trap, the people who are able to keep making progress, I mean, just to give some context, the oldest person I work with is 75 and she is still getting faster today, which I just think is the coolest thing in the world. But in the case of all those people who are able to make a kind of continuous and sustained progress, it's because they're not just doing sessions, they're actually following a structured program that takes into account, what their strengths and weaknesses are and their ability to handle training load. Because someone who is able to, or let me put this another way, a certain training program might be absolutely fine for one person in a particular context where, they have no external responsibilities. Maybe they're a college-aged athlete who really they have to go to class a couple of times a day, and they have a few periods of the year where they have a bit of exam pressure. But generally speaking, they don't have a ton of pressure day to day versus someone who is, running a business, has young kids, that type of thing. The same training is going to have a different recovery profile, because one person can dedicate themselves to train, recover, repeat, and the other person trains and then never truly gets a chance to recover because of those other stresses. So making sure that a program is actually, not just specific to what someone needs from a stimulus perspective, but also taking into account the recovery that they're going to be able, or that they're going to require to be able to handle that particular training as well. So taking those two factors into account, having a structured program, but also considering the human who's doing that program is the big difference between people who end up working super hard in any sport and just kind of getting stuck versus people who are able to keep making progress over time.
I think you've raised a really good point about the trap of social media, of how it gives you, and that's, we can talk about sport to one degree and physical development, but then also as a, I guess, influence sense, that there's that trap of seeing, you're only seeing 0.01% of someone's life. And you've seen a highlight reel essentially. And I think a lot of PTs and coaches and myself in the past, you forget that there is more to training than meets the eye, especially when you take the allostatic load of life. As you said, you've got youth athletes. We've both had that in the past where, yes, they don't have responsibilities and have a mortgage and have kids. They also do have school and they do have a lot of exam stress and lifestyle factors, but it's a different type of lifestyle factor. And I think it's very important that as coaches and also as athletes as well, recreational athletes or fitness enthusiasts, that you need to take into account the other stresses that aren't so objective, such as lifestyle, such as performance. And I guess for you, when we talk about that element of being bespoke to your lifestyle, what are some of the differences you kind of differentiate between individuals that are maybe of the masters realm versus those that are in their 20s and 30s, where kind of that kind of responsibility isn't as massive in their development?
Well, I think fundamentally people are always individuals, even when they are, different age brackets. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily always as black and white as, high school or college athletes are this and masters are that. But the general trends, things that I'm looking for when I'm looking at someone's life is what's the difference between chronic and acute stress. So what I mean by that is, to take the example of someone who's high school, college, as you mentioned, they still have things like exam pressures and assignments and stuff like this, but these tend to be more acute. They're clustered together into usually these quite tight pinch points where everything comes to you at once, versus someone who, to use the example before of someone who's, running a business, has a mortgage, has young kids, etc. They have a kind of a chronic stress that's just continuous across the time. It may have small peaks and troughs, but it's generally fairly stable, but at a higher level. Whereas someone who, in that college environment, it may have a lower level of, we'll call it baseline stress or baseline external factors, but does have those real spike points. And sometimes you get people who are almost the perfect storm where, one of my clients, for instance, he's an accountant, and you get to the end of financial year and he's absolutely pumped for an acute stress period, but he still has, outside of that, he's got a mortgage, he's got kids and all that sort of stuff as well. So for someone like him, you have to factor in both. But generally speaking, if there's a higher level of chronic stress, so if someone listening, if they're a masters athlete or, an everyday athlete, who is managing those other things, you have to have more consideration for recovery. And the two things that I always consider as the key things to think about is, what is your time between hard sessions? So the amount of recovery that you actually space them out. But then the other factor is, what do you do in between? So in rowing, for instance, one of the big mistakes that people make is that in their time between hard sessions, there's a tendency towards training kind of hard, but not as hard as a quote unquote hard session. And so they're not actually allowing their body to recover between sessions. And they're also missing out on the fact that doing genuinely low intensity work actually improves the body's ability to recover by increasing, cardiac outputs, stroke volume, and so forth, which improves the body's ability to bring nutrients around the body, to clear waste products, and actually speeds up the process of recovering from those hard sessions. So that's definitely what we'll look for someone who has that more of that chronic stress. Whereas someone who has the lower baseline but more acute stress, it's more about figuring out in their kind of overall season calendar where those moments are going to be, and positioning the work appropriately so that, you're not trying to get to a heavy week at the same time that a college athlete has has finals, for instance, for their exams, because that's just not going to work. So it's really more about where in the year do you put certain things for someone who has more of those acute stresses, and managing the recovery between sessions to a greater extent when it's people who have more of that chronic stress.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think a lot of people just blaze over that straight away and they get into thicker training, don't actually take into account those areas. I guess I want to peel a little layer deeper, because I think it's really important to, one, assess kind of as a baseline where we are. And as coaches, that's kind of part of the course for us. But let's quantify that a little bit more. And I want to kind of, I guess, put the onus on you and guess what you do. And you can be vague to a degree with what you do things, because everyone has their own key thing, and that's what makes us coaches. But for you, walk me through a little bit about where you start and how you quantify that load for someone when they come to you. Obviously, I know your sport is specifically rowing.
So when I first start working with someone, the first place that we always start is with some fairly simple testing that we do on the ergo. This is just partly to create a baseline of where they're starting. But the reason I do the specific testing that I do is for me to be able to assess each of their three energy systems. So their anaerobic alactic system, anaerobic lactic, and the aerobic system. And from that, I can then determine, well, what is the type of training that, when it comes to the high intensity work, that's going to get the biggest response from them. And this is obviously more thinking from an endurance perspective, but specifically to rowing. But what is the type of training that's going to make the biggest difference to them? And then the nature of that is automatically going to start to dictate what type of recovery they need. If someone needs to do, anaerobic training, well, we know that even though the volume is low, the training intensity of anaerobic training is very high. And so the recovery cost of it, and particularly the central nervous system loading from that type of work, is quite high. So straight away, they're automatically going to need to have more time in between.
Got it.
If they're going to be training anaerobic threshold, you can do that more frequently. You can do that with less recovery in between. You can get away with maybe 48 hours between sessions and go that kind of high-low approach to programming. And that's going to be fine, because the recovery cost of threshold, at least over a relatively short period of time, the acute training load is not that great. It's obviously still difficult in the moment, but the recovery is quite different. So that's the first place.
On that in particular, because I obviously, talking about the spectrum of aerobic to anaerobic, some people may not be too kind of knowledgeable on that side. Could you break that down into a little bit of detail, just for kind of the layman? What are you talking about in terms of that spectrum?
Yeah, sure. So when you perform physical activity of any kind, whether it's rowing or whether it's high rocks, whether it's weightlifting, whatever it might be, your body's always using, to a certain degree, the three energy systems that your body has. So these are the different ways that your body can produce energy from fuel sources within the body. So the first of these, or first in terms of the shortest lived and the one that activates first, is what's called the anaerobic phosphocreatine system, or ATP-PC, or alactic. So alactic is the shortest. You could think of this as peak power. This is your ability to produce a maximal effort kind of on demand. You can't repeat it. This generally is the main fuel source for up to about 10 to 15 seconds of work. The next system is the anaerobic lactate system. The word, pardon the slight tangent, because anaerobic was in both of those. Anaerobic literally means without oxygen. Fun fact, it was actually coined by Louis Pasteur, who invented pasteurization. It doesn't come from physiology, but it means literally without oxygen. So these two processes happen really quickly, and they don't require oxygen as a catalyst to be able to break down a fuel source to create energy. Then you move into the aerobic processes. So these take a bit longer to get kind of up and running, but these produce much more continuous sustained energy use. So the anaerobic lactic system operates 30 to 90 seconds, call it, as being kind of the main producer. That 15 to 30 seconds is a bit of a crossover period with the alactic. And then that kind of 90 seconds and beyond is going to be primarily aerobics. Obviously, I'm simplifying. The aerobic system, then there's kind of two key markers that I look at from coming from an exercise physiology background when I'm thinking about training program. And these are two things people have probably heard of, one being threshold, and the other being VO2 max. So threshold is refers to an intensity where at that point you could continue on without accumulating much more lactate. It's generally going to be below kind of race pace, shall we call it, but it would generally be the intensity you could hold for even up to 60 minutes if you were right on the right spot with it. The VO2 max is much shorter and literally refers to the maximum kind of aerobic capacity, or the maximum amount of aerobic power you could produce. And depending which system you're using and depending on which system you're relying on, it's going to have an impact, going back to that idea of recovery.
Yeah, the one big thing I think on that is it's all proportional. So depending on the energy and intensity, it's going to be relevant to the fuel source. So fat and beta oxidation, which is utilizing fat, is going to take slower amount. But the point I'm making is because there's low intensity, it's going to drive from a fuel source that is not going to need that amount of time and also output. On the top end, you've got ATP, which is obviously PC system, phosphocreatine, which a lot of people use creatine. As we know, its benefits for explosive power. So you get that. I like the analogy, and I know we may have lost some people in that way, which, look, it is complicated. So you're very much in the right mindset. If you do, don't worry about it. But it's a case of, I use an electric car, whereas you've got electric and petrol. Now, I'm oversimplifying this. So in terms of the parallels, there's probably, you can get lost, but simply at any point in time, the car is using multiple fuel sources. At some point, it's going to be more of a predominant on electric, more predominant on gas. When you go harder and faster, you're going to use more petrol or gas. And then when you're slower, use more electric. And that's same as aerobic to anaerobic. And that's the analogy I like to use, especially with working with youth athletes. But you sum that really, really well. In terms for you, and let's get this a little bit more specific, because someone they may be doing a marathon or high rocks and they're going through their training and they're kind of thinking about, okay, right, what do I need to prioritize in my training? With the systems we just spoke about and your training, when we quantify it, what key things are we looking at in terms of next steps? How would you go about that sort of scenario?
So once you know what the event, based on the event that they're doing, is going to depend on, or is going to influence what the event demands are, is going to influence what training they need. So someone who is training for a marathon, for instance, they're not going to be doing a high amount of anaerobic work inside the marathon. As you said, there's always a proportion. It's not like they don't do any, but the relative proportion of that is going to be extremely low. So when I look at that initial testing that I do with someone, we're going to take that into account in determining which is the strongest and weakest systems. Now, you could still have a system where a marathon runner, depending on the kind of physical makeup, where anaerobic actually still is the biggest issue for them. It's unlikely because of its relatively small contribution, but it is possible. Same as someone who is a 200-meter runner or a 400-meter runner, let's say a 400-meter runner, might actually, even though this is a much more anaerobic activity, they might actually still have the issue that their aerobic system is the weakest, because the aerobic system is still active even in those periods, and it also plays a role because it's the aerobic system that is responsible for recycling lactate. This plays a role in keeping people below their anaerobic threshold, because it's the issue with regards to lactic is not production, it's accumulation, which means that when you're producing it, you're also recycling some of it, and the better and the faster you are at recycling it, the more you can produce before you start to accumulate. And so someone who you absolutely want to look at the event and see where the demands of the event are. Like, all training should be demand driven, which is the idea that the sessions you do are to get the specific adaptation you're looking for. But even within that context, you can still have people who they need to develop the system that seems like it's not the thing for their particular sport or event.
I really like the way you summarize that. You've done a better job than me. I think we wrote there it's demand driven. And I think a lot of people get that confused with sport specific, because it's about the physical demands. And this is why I hammer home so much, and you've done the same as well, is we want to have the underpinning characteristics for the sport too. You want to train harder than the sport itself so that you can keep up with the demands. What you don't want is the sport to look like the training, because that's where you get a bit sticky. And maybe rowing, because it's more of a physical sport in terms of, yes, there's skill acquisition, because obviously, and I'm not a rowing coach, so I don't want to demonize by saying limiting the skill acquisition, but taking the catch phase, and we've spoken at time, shown my ignorance. There is a skill component, but majority of it is very physical. So there is a cross, I guess, parallel to that. Whereas some other sports, which are more kind of externally paced, and there's more of an agility element to it, they try to recreate those skills or developments in, and I spoke in a previous podcast about functional patterns, and that sort of idea, it doesn't get any traction the minute you start it, because you're not actually building any physical quality. It's not, the demands aren't great enough.
Yeah.
I guess on that, your sport, with rowing, it'd be intriguing to know, and I've gone completely off tangent. Does that show up in rowing? Because you see that in most other sports.
As in people trying to make things more specific.
Yeah.
The place you typically look, yes, you absolutely do. Where you see that manifested most commonly is particularly people who are really want to see an improvement quickly will do, let's say they've got a 2K ergo coming up. They'll try and do one every week. But the problem is, like, the analogy I use for the 2K for a race, and really it applies to any kind of sport in terms of like the actual event itself, is that it's like doing a practice exam and getting a final grade, but not knowing what questions you got right and wrong. You don't actually know what are the components that you need to get better at to be able to improve your result. You just know what the final result is. So that's where doing the 2K. Yes, it is literally the most race, like, event specific thing you can do, but it's actually not very good training, because you're just kind of summarizing all of the components rather than working on the ones that could potentially be holding back the performance. The other place it comes up a lot in rowing is in the weights room. And there's been I think a long a history of strength and conditioning in rowing that's been based around doing, it's 220 strokes for a 2,000-meter race approximately. So, okay, we need to do 220 squats and we need to do 220 bench pulls, because these are the things that most closely mimic the kind of the movement that you're doing. And as you'd know, that's just not a good way to train. It's not going to help you get better at things important. There's an athlete that I coached. I won't mention the school or anything like that, but one of the things that their coach advised them to do for the season was to do 2,000 leg presses a week at 40 kilos. And so they'd go in, 5 times a week at lunchtime, and they'd do 400 leg presses at 40 kilos. And I actually understand the thought process, which is we're trying to build local muscular endurance. It's a way of elevating the heart rate in a way that doesn't load the ribs or lower back or anything like that. Fundamentally, though, there are just much better ways to achieve that same outcome, whether it's using the bike, whether it's using the ergo, whether it's using, other forms of cross-training. That specific choice, I understand the thought process, but it's not the best way to do it.
I'm
not to say that there's no value in it.
Yeah.
But it's not the most effective way. And the recovery cost of that, particularly 5 days a week, is actually quite high, even though the relative load of 40 kilos per leg press is quite low. But yeah, like circuit training was massive in rowing for a long time. And that started to change. There's more of a focus on building general physical qualities like strength, power, robustness, etc. But that's definitely where it's probably most prominently shown up in rowing over the years is, 220 squats or 6 minutes of squatting would be the other one. Put everyone on exactly the same weight face to face and just squat continuously for 6 minutes to replicate a 2K race. You and I know that's
it traditionally sounds like a tactical trying to cover S&C, if I'm honest. Like many occasions, previous guest was spoken about his combat S&C and boxing coaches, for example. It's just that you're going to bury them into the ground, and it's like, who's the fittest? Well, who's the one that can gas out the last, basically? And that is a very kind of like non-S&C coach sort of mentality to have and adopt. And I think the sports that don't predominantly have an S&C culture tend to have that highlighted the most, such as yourself.
And that's something I definitely came to relatively early in my coaching career. So I started coaching. I was a high performance lightweight rower.
Talk to me a bit about your kind of athletic journey from when you was collegiate, I think it was.
So I started in high school. I actually started rowing to get out of a detention. Basically, it was the first day of high school, or the day before the first day of high school, and I had to go to. I lived next door to the school, and I had to go to the uniform shop for something. I honestly don't remember what it was, but for whatever reason, probably because I live in Australia, I didn't wear any shoes, And so I was on campus with no shoes, and the school marshal was there that day, who was the person responsible for discipline and uniform and all that kind of stuff. And so he pulled me up and he said, boy, what are you doing? Where are your shoes? And I said, oh, sorry, sir, I just had to pop over to the uniform shop to get something. And I just didn't think about it. And he looked me up and down and said, what year level are you? And I said, how old are you? I said, I'm 12, sir. And he said, put your arms out. And I went like this, and you wouldn't be able to tell on here, but I'm 6 foot. I was 6 foot when I was 12. I haven't grown a day. So he looked at me as this 12-year-old and went, my God, he's going to be my next big thing in rowing. And so he said, here's the sign up sheet for rowing, or it's going to be here tomorrow. Tomorrow you're going to put your name down on it, and in return you're not going to get a detention. And that was how I got started in rowing. And I rowed throughout school. I never grew again, which was a great disappointment. But I rowed my school program. We won the national championships in the schoolboy quad. I rowed beyond school as a lightweight for a couple of years. Long story short, when my dad passed away, I stopped rowing and went more into coaching. So I've been coaching now for 20 years this year. And in that time, I would describe myself as a rowing tragic. So where I lived for a long period of time, the boys' schoolboy season and the girls' schoolgirl season were consecutive. So one rowed in the summer, one rowed in the winter. So I did both. So by the time I'd been coaching for 7 years, when I left that particular city, I'd done 14 school seasons of coaching. But I'd also done club coaching throughout that time as well, taking club crews to the national championships, doing high performance coaching, won several national championships, had people selected to represent Australia, and that type of thing. So I got a lot of experience very quickly, which was advantageous for me in my career. But very early on, I recognized that as an athlete, I had got an enormous benefit from strength and conditioning. So I started doing strength training only after I'd left school, after my first season of lightweight rowing beyond school.
How old were you around then?
About 19.
Okay.
And I had one really, really solid off season. That was all it took, was 6 months where I got very, very solidly into the gym. It was a fairly basic program, but I was very, very diligent about following it, about progressing it, and trying to do it with great range of motion, and because that's what someone had told me was super important. Great advice. And I went from squatting about 80 kilos at 65 myself to squatting 150 kilos at 70 myself. So went from sort of 1.2 to over a 2, over a twice body weight. And the difference in my performance on the water and on the ergo was, just like that. So that really highlighted for me how important strength and conditioning was as a component of training and how much of a difference it could make. And so I made a point early in my rowing coaching career of going away to do strength and conditioning accreditations. I studied exercise and sports science at university, worked as an exercise physiologist, worked as an S&C coach, in addition to all that rowing coaching. And it's just consistently been one of these things that has, in every program, I've been a director of rowing for 12 years. I've run Australia's biggest school programs, and the best performances in those programs have come when we've had the S&C really dialed in. So I think the value there is enormous. But I realized really early in my career that the way strength and conditioning was done in rowing, that I saw from what everyone else was doing, particularly what elite rowers were doing, I looked at through the eyes of someone who was studying sport and exercise science, who was an S&C coach, and went, this is crazy. They're all doing amazingly well in their sport, but it's not because of the training. It's almost in spite of it. And I think the nature of a lot of the work that was done, this was in the 90s and 2000s, and presumably much earlier, was that the people who got to that level didn't get there because of that training. It was almost like the fact that they could do the training showed that they were already at a physical level where they could be successful. It was more like it revealed who was capable rather than creating people who were capable rather. So that was a real eye opener. And then that carried through to studying exercise physiology and sport and exercise science. In that I realized that the way a lot of traditional programs trained was very much built around this is what we've always done and not around a good basis in sports science. And so I mentioned I've been director of rowing for 12 years. I had the opportunity to apply actual sports science principles to training programs that I ran throughout that time period, and we had a really outsized level of success. For some of the programs I ran, one of the programs in particular in New South Wales was a tiny regional program. It had about 20 kids rowing. First, this is a totally different topic, I was able to grow it to 80 people, but big focus on culture and retention. But the other thing was by just training in a very, specific and, evidence-based way, that small program won 26 state championship medals in 2 years.
Just on that then, what do you think, based upon what you knew the environment was like in terms of just the level of S&C, what was I guess obviously it wasn't just one thing, but what was the most important thing that you changed in the practical S&C that made such a difference?
Getting strong. Actually working on building strength rather than on muscular endurance. And that, as I said, that was that real philosophy in rowing, was whether it was through circuit training or just really high reps of a single set, a single 6-minute set of squats or whatever it might be, was that you actually, for the sport, you were already doing so much endurance work by rowing, by erging, by cross training, etc., that the quality that was missing was strength.
Yeah.
And whether it was a school program, when we got athletes strong, they got fast. And athletes who weren't fast, when they got strong, they went fast. Now, this will be a bit of a tangent, but it might be interesting to some of the people listening, is that there's a very famous crew in rowing called the Kiwi pair. So it's Hamish Bond and Eric Murray, who were Olympic gold medalists in 2012 and in 2016. And for 8 years, so the entire London and Rio cycles, they went unbeaten. Actually won 69 races without not winning a single time.
Wow.
All the World Cups, all the World Championships, and obviously the 2 Olympic titles. And famously, they didn't lift. They didn't do any formal strength training. So they made a decision in 2009 to forego weights training to just do more volume. And that, taken out of context, has really continued to influence this idea that strength training is not beneficial for rowing. And I think that's simply not the case. The reality is, when those two people came together in the pair in 2009, they were already very, very strong. They'd also already done years of strength training up to that point. And by their own admission, it wasn't they did nothing. They did band work, they did plyometrics, they did things that will have helped them to maintain their level of strength, but they didn't actively try and improve it. And so that's often taken out of context in rowing, that the Kiwi pair didn't lift, so I don't need to either. But the way I see strength training is really there's 2 elements to it. This applies to rowing, but equally to other sports. I'm going to say something controversial. Strength training is not necessary, but being strong is. And for most people, and I was like that as well as that 19-year-old, most people need the strength training to become strong. But it is actually the strength is the quality that people need to be able to perform really well in almost any sport. And unless you are physically very gifted, or you've come through, and even for somebody who's physically gifted, you probably also have a massive training background in your past that has helped you to get to that point. But that's why strength training is useful, is because you need to be strong, not because the strength training is itself a necessity. That is just one method to get to the requirement.
Yeah, I'm a massive agreement, a massive fan of that, because I say to a lot of people, and my demographics, typically those that are in late 20s to up to kind of early 40s, and who I work with, and it's like you're not broken, you're just weak. And what I generally mean by that is, we talk about mobility and general kind of function and longevity. Mobility, in my eyes, is strength through range. If you're able to dominate own end ranges, then you have the capacity to be mobile in range, or have a range of mobility that you can access. And a lot of the time you see, especially, there is a point where there's diminishing returns with the strength development. And for the majority of people, they are nowhere near that point where they can't turn around and say, I don't need strength training,
Yeah.
because you have unfortunately, you don't have an iota of how much strength training you need to get to that point. And typically we see that, I can't remember the principle, but there is a principle with top level athletes that you get someone who doesn't shine on a big football pitch, but then put them in a Sunday league game and they are by far miles ahead of everyone. And it's due to the level of quality as well as development they actually have underpinned that gets, I guess, darkened or dampened when they're in an environment where there's everyone at that same level.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I haven't heard that phrase in terms of like a principle, but I mean, it's just the relative level, you know, the relative level of you know, wherever you are versus, and the environment that you're in.
And I think that's, unfortunately, you don't see that a lot back to social media. Everyone seems to think they can compete at that level, or they have that same sort of dedication and standard of operation when they're miles off.
Or the other end is that they think that they're, you know, absolutely hopeless because what they see on social media is so far from where they're at that they go, what's the point of even continuing? I must be hopeless. But, you know, if they're an everyday athlete who is competing at their level, they actually might still be really good and be really competitive and be able to have these awesome experiences. And if they train well, they'll be able to, you know, to be at the top of that. But they're seeing what, you know, the world champions do or whatever and go, oh, well, I'm nowhere near that. So I think it actually works both ways, and both are negative.
No, definitely. And it's surprising because you are right. And when I caveat what I said with the fact that, like, the actual time it takes and it's the consistency that you apply it with, you'd be very surprised within the speed of yourself, 6 months to a year, when you turn 19, you develop this capacity and resilience that can transfer to your sport really, really accurately well. And it's the same with most people. They just, you don't know what you don't know. It's the Dunning-Kruger effect. I guess I wanted to segue this conversation because it's brought to me an idea in terms of the way I end the podcast is I talk about a takeaway, a take home, to give the listeners one key thing that they can actually apply today. So for yourself, if you had someone come up to you, they didn't have a coach, or it's before them getting a coach, before changing their program, what could they change, one element about their setup or an action they can implement that will give them that direction towards that, whether it's individualization, that development in their kind of performance if they're plateauing? What's one thing to focus on in their own training?
I mean, it's going to be different for different sports, but if I think about it from a rowing context, it would be to actually differentiate between your high intensity training and your low intensity training. And low intensity training or easy days, whatever, you don't have to come away with that feeling that, that I used every minute of that. There's a big difference between that and junk training. But, you know, if you do low intensity training, my general rule is you should finish it and still feel like you could go for another hour. You might not want to mentally, or your joints might not like you, but you should feel that aerobically and in terms of your breathing and all that kind of stuff and your effort, that you could go for another hour. But that's where you stop. And then that allows you to make sure that your hard sessions or your high intensity training can be truly high intensity in a way that is going to give you the biggest performance benefits. And that kind of principle applies to, you know, almost any sport. That, you know, the idea of high low, but low has to be genuinely low for that to work. If your lows are actually here, your highs are going to be here, and then you just never get the level of stimulus that you need to really, really drive performance improvement. So I think for someone who wanted just one thing to take away from this conversation, that would be my message to people, is make sure that the training you do is specific to what it is meant to be doing, and not just to trying to make every day kind of feel like you worked kind of hard.
Brilliant. No, I really like that. And I think as you see it so much, but it goes back to the beginning of the conversation about kind of more isn't better.
Yeah.
And it's that kind of load management. And this came up in the previous pod about kind of how important load management is. And obviously we have the fitness wearables, Whoop, that side of things. And objective data is really important. But it's just making sure that on those rest days and recovery days, you are adequately recovering. This idea of active recovery, which albeit you can have to a degree, and there's certain nuances to that, is something that people are popularizing nowadays. And I think it gets wrongly programmed and prescribed. And it's just, there's more load or more neural fatigue in the system.
I think there's like a cultural effect that the idea of like being idle is so demonized. Particularly the faster paced the world becomes. I think that's really prominent. But the body is still the same body we had, however long ago, and it still requires rest. It still requires enough stimulus as well to improve. And if you can't give it those two things, because they go hand in hand, then you're not going to improve in your sport.
Brilliant. That's a great way to summarize the pod. Before we go, Sam, where can people find you?
I am on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. The handle at Sam Dutney, all one word. I mostly post rowing content so it may not be the right stuff for your audience, but I'm there pretty much every single day, putting up content, educational content around training performance and rowing. And you can find me on all three of those platforms.
Yeah, no, I must say your YouTube content of late has been popping in terms of you've got a good way of simplifying very complex topics. So definitely, it's a skill in itself.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
And a big thanks to Sam for taking time out of his day to join us and share his expertise, all things rowing S&C. Now be sure to check the show notes out if you want to follow Sam on his socials and understand a little bit more about what rowing S&C looks like. Now, if you're looking for one-to-one support within your physical development, becoming stronger, fitter, faster in a matter of months, be sure to book a strategy call in with me on our website, that's SamiHusseinSC.com, or alternatively, you can reach out on Instagram by DM me at coach_Sami Hussein. Until next time, I'll see you soon.